In the remote wilderness where civilization ends and nature reclaims its throne, some people learn that survival isn't just about being tough. It's about understanding the ancient language of predators and prey. When cattle rustlers thought they could intimidate a lone rancher by eliminating her loyal guard dogs, they had no idea they were about to face something far more dangerous than any domesticated animal. They were about to meet creatures that remembered what it meant to hunt in packs, to kill without mercy, and to protect their chosen family with a ferocity that would make their worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. This is the true story of how one woman's unconventional approach to ranch protection turned a routine cattle theft into a legend that still sends shivers down the spines of anyone foolish enough to think they can take what isn't theirs in wolf country. Sarah Mackenzie had always been different from other ranchers in the Montana wilderness. While her neighbors relied on traditional methods of protecting their livestock, she had chosen a path that most would consider impossible, even dangerous. Her ranch, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests and rocky outcroppings, was home to more than just cattle and horses. It was sanctuary to a pack of wolves that she had raised from pups after their mother was killed by poachers 3 years earlier. The story began when Sarah was working as a wildlife biologist for the state before inheriting her grandfather's ranch. During one of her field studies, she discovered a den with 3 wolf pups whose mother had been shot by illegal hunters. The pups were barely 3 weeks old, their eyes still closed, completely dependent on milk that would never come again. Most wildlife experts would have recommended euthanizing them, as hand-raised wolves rarely survive in the wild and pose potential dangers to humans. But Sarah saw something different in those tiny, vulnerable creatures. She saw partners. Against all professional advice and state regulations, Sarah took the pups home. She knew the risks involved in raising apex predators, but she also understood wolf behavior better than almost anyone in the region. She had spent years studying pack dynamics, communication patterns, and the intricate social structures that made wolves such successful hunters and protectors. She believed that with proper training and socialization, these wolves could become something unprecedented, willing guardians of domestic livestock rather than their natural predators. The early months were exhausting and dangerous. Sarah bottle-fed the pups every 2 hours, sleeping in shifts to ensure they received constant care. She established herself as the alpha of their pack through careful dominance displays and consistent behavioral reinforcement. Unlike dogs, wolves require a more nuanced approach to training. They are intelligent enough to question authority and strong enough to challenge it physically. Sarah had to prove herself worthy of their loyalty not through force, but through demonstrating her capability as a leader. As the wolves grew, Sarah named them Storm, Shadow, and Frost. Storm was the largest and most dominant, a male with silver-gray fur and piercing yellow eyes that seemed to see through to a person's soul. Shadow was the smallest but quickest, a female with midnight black fur who moved like liquid darkness through the forest. Frost was the mediator, a female with white-tipped fur who seemed to understand human emotions better than the others, and often served as the bridge between Sarah's world and the wild instincts of her pack brothers. The training process took nearly 2 years. Sarah worked with the wolves daily, teaching them to distinguish between her cattle and wild prey. She used scent training, positive reinforcement, and careful exposure to help them understand that the cattle were under her protection. The breakthrough came when a mountain lion threatened one of her calves. Instead of joining the predator or fleeing, Storm positioned himself between the calf and the lion, growling with such ferocity that the mountain lion retreated without a fight. Sarah knew then that her experiment was succeeding. Word of Sarah's unusual guardian spread slowly through the ranching community. Most of her neighbors thought she had lost her mind, while others were curious about the effectiveness of her methods. Her ranch had virtually no predation losses, something that was almost unheard of in an area where mountain lions, bears, and ironically, wild wolf packs regularly took livestock. The 3 wolves patrolled the ranch boundaries constantly, their presence deterring other predators more effectively than any fence or guard dog ever could. However, Sarah's success came with a price. She lived in constant tension with local authorities who viewed her wolves as dangerous animals that should be relocated or destroyed. She had managed to obtain special permits through her connections in the wildlife department, but those permits came with strict conditions and regular inspections. Any sign of aggression toward humans or livestock would result in the immediate removal of her pack. The wolves themselves adapted remarkably well to ranch life, but they never lost their wild nature. They were affectionate with Sarah, greeting her with the complex body language and vocalizations of their species. They would bring her gifts of small prey, share their kills with her, and sleep near her cabin on cold nights. But they remained aloof and potentially dangerous to strangers. Sarah had to carefully manage any visitors to her ranch, ensuring that the wolves were secured before anyone else arrived. Her relationship with the local ranching community was complicated. While some admired her innovative approach and undeniable results, others viewed her as a threat to their traditional way of life. Wolves had been hunted to near extinction in the area precisely because they were seen as enemies of livestock operations. Having someone not only protecting wolves, but using them as guardians seemed like a betrayal of ranching values to many of her neighbors. The ranch itself reflected Sarah's unique situation. Her fencing was designed not just to keep cattle in, but to provide escape routes and hiding places for her wolves. She had constructed elevated platforms throughout the property where the wolves could observe their territory and rest safely. Her cabin was reinforced with extra strong doors and windows, not to keep the wolves out, but to provide a secure space where she could retreat if their pack dynamics ever turned dangerous. Sarah's daily routine revolved around her unusual family. She would rise before dawn to check on both her cattle and her wolves, often finding them together in the pastures where the wolves had spent the night patrolling. The sight of her cattle grazing peacefully while 3 wolves rested nearby was surreal, something that seemed to defy the natural order. Yet it worked, and it worked better than any conventional protection method she had ever seen. The local wildlife also adapted to the presence of Sarah's pack. Deer and elk learned to avoid the ranch entirely, while smaller predators like coyotes and foxes found new territories rather than risk confrontation with creatures that were larger, stronger, and more intelligent than they were. Even black bears, normally confident in their dominance of the mountain ecosystem, treated the ranch as neutral territory to be avoided rather than explored. As word of Sarah's success spread beyond the local community, she began receiving visitors from universities and wildlife management agencies. Researchers wanted to study her methods and document the unprecedented relationship she had developed with her wolves. Some were supportive and fascinated, while others were skeptical and concerned about the precedent she was setting. The debate over her methods became a topic of discussion in wildlife management circles across the country. Despite the controversy surrounding her methods, Sarah found peace in her chosen lifestyle. The morning howls of her pack had become as comforting as any alarm clock, and the sight of storm, shadow, and frost moving through her property with quiet confidence gave her a sense of security that no human-made protection could match. She had created something unique in the modern world, a functional partnership between human civilization and wild nature. But Sarah was not naive about the challenges she faced. She knew that her wolves were living on borrowed time in a world that had little tolerance for apex predators. Every day brought the possibility that some incident could end her experiment and cost her the lives of the animals she had come to love as family. The balance she had achieved was delicate, dependent on her constant vigilance and the continued cooperation of creatures that, despite their loyalty to her, remained wild at heart. The ranch had become more than just a cattle operation. It was a symbol of what was possible when humans chose cooperation over domination in their relationship with nature. But symbols, Sarah knew, were often the first targets when conflicts arose. And conflict was coming to her peaceful valley, brought by men who understood only the language of violence and saw her unconventional guardians as nothing more than obstacles to be eliminated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only Sarah's bond with her wolves, but also the very limits of what civilized society was willing to tolerate in the name of protecting property and preserving traditional ways of life. The rustlers who were planning to target her ranch had no idea that they were about to encounter something far more dangerous than guard dogs or security systems. They were about to face the fury of creatures that had never forgotten how to hunt. The Johnson brothers had been stealing cattle across 3 counties for over 2 years, and their methods were brutally efficient. Jake, the eldest at 34, planned their operations with military precision from his time in the Army. His younger brother, Pete, 28, handled the actual theft with the skill of someone who had grown up around livestock. The youngest, Danny, at 23, served as their lookout and getaway driver, his nervous energy perfectly suited for watching roads and keeping their escape routes clear. They had heard about Sarah Mackenzie's ranch through whispered conversations in bars and truck stops. According to local gossip, she was a woman living alone on a valuable spread with a herd of prime cattle and no apparent security beyond some unusual guard dogs. To the Johnson brothers, she sounded like the perfect target. They had no idea that the guard dogs people mentioned in hushed, uncertain tones were actually something far more dangerous. The brothers spent 3 weeks surveilling Sarah's property, using hunting blinds and trail cameras to map her daily routines. They noticed that she seemed to have remarkable control over her animals, and that her cattle were in excellent condition despite the minimal visible security. What they interpreted as guard dogs appeared to be unusually large and moved with a strange, flowing gait that was different from any breed they recognized. But the Johnson brothers were not naturalists or animal experts. They were thieves who saw valuable livestock and believed they had found an easy mark. Their plan was straightforward and had worked on a dozen other ranches. They would approach under cover of darkness, eliminate any guard dogs with poisoned meat, then use their cattle trailers to load and transport the animals before dawn. They had stolen over 200 head of cattle using this method and had never encountered serious resistance. Ranch dogs, no matter how large or aggressive, were ultimately just domesticated animals that could be easily dealt with by men who were prepared and ruthless. On the night of the raid, the brothers parked their trucks and trailers on a logging road nearly 2 miles from Sarah's ranch. They carried with them tranquilizer guns, poison bait, and enough firepower to handle any complications that might arise. Jake had insisted on bringing his military-grade night vision equipment, while Pete carried a modified cattle prod that could deliver enough voltage to drop a bull. Danny remained with the vehicles, engines running and radios ready for emergency evacuation. As Jake and Pete approached the ranch perimeter, they immediately noticed something was wrong. The silence was too complete, too unnatural for a property that should have been guarded by dogs. There were no barks, no growls, no sounds of animals moving through the underbrush. Instead, there was a quality to the darkness that felt watchful and predatory. Both men were experienced hunters and had spent countless hours in wilderness environments, but neither had ever experienced the sensation of being observed by something that remained completely invisible. The poison bait they scattered along their approach route went untouched. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Some guard dogs were better trained and more disciplined than others. What troubled Jake more was the complete absence of normal forest sounds. No owls called, no small animals rustled through the leaves, no insects buzzed around their headlamps. It was as if every living creature in the area had either fled or was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. When they reached the cattle pasture, they found the herd clustered together in the center of the field, rather than scattered across the available grazing area as would be normal during nighttime hours. The cattle were alert but not panicked, standing close together with their heads raised and their ears pricked forward. They were clearly aware of the intruders, but seemed to be waiting for something rather than fleeing or becoming agitated. Pete began setting up the portable fencing they used to guide cattle toward their trailers, while Jake scanned the area with his night vision scope for any sign of the guard dogs they expected to encounter. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. 3 shapes were moving through the darkness at the edge of the forest, and they were not moving like any dogs he had ever seen. They flowed across the ground like shadows given form, their gait low and predatory, their movements coordinated with the precision of military units advancing on a target. Before Jake could warn his brother, the attack began. It was not the chaotic barking and snapping that they would have expected from guard dogs. Instead, it was executed with the silent efficiency of apex predators that had been hunting in coordinated packs for thousands of years. Storm emerged from the darkness directly in front of Pete, his yellow eyes reflecting the starlight as he positioned himself between the intruder and the cattle. Shadow appeared simultaneously on Jake's left flank, while Frost materialized on his right, creating a triangle formation that gave the wolves multiple angles of attack and eliminated most escape routes. Brothers' first mistake was reaching for their weapons. Wolves are capable of detecting aggressive intent through body language and scent markers that humans are not consciously aware of producing. The moment Jake's hand moved toward his tranquilizer gun, Storm launched himself forward with a speed and power that seemed to defy physics. His 140-pound body struck Pete in the chest with the force of a small vehicle, driving him to the ground and sending his cattle prod flying into the darkness. Jake managed to bring his night vision scope to bear on the attacking wolf, but before he could fire, Shadow struck him from behind. Her smaller size was deceptive. She had used her speed to circle behind him while he was focused on Storm's frontal assault. Her teeth closed on his wrist with crushing force, causing him to drop his weapon as nerve damage made his hand useless. Frost moved in to secure the area, herding both men away from their scattered equipment, and toward the center of the field where they would be completely exposed and unable to reach any kind of cover. The wolves did not kill the intruders, though they clearly had the capability to do so. Instead, they held them in place with a kind of controlled aggression that spoke to their intelligence and training. Storm maintained his position over Pete, his massive jaws inches from the man's throat, while Shadow kept Jake's injured arm pinned to prevent him from reaching any hidden weapons. Frost circled the perimeter, ensuring that no escape routes remained open and watching for additional threats. It was then that Sarah appeared, emerging from her cabin with a rifle in her hands and an expression of cold fury on her face. She had been awakened by the subtle changes in her wolves' behavior patterns that had alerted her to the presence of intruders. The special bond she had developed with her pack included a kind of emotional communication that warned her when they sensed danger or became agitated by unfamiliar presence on their territory. The scene that greeted her was exactly what she had trained her wolves to achieve: complete neutralization of threats without unnecessary killing. The Rustlers were immobilized and disarmed, held in place by creatures that could have torn them apart in seconds, but had instead chosen restraint and precision. It was a demonstration of the kind of controlled power that made wolves such successful predators in the wild and such effective guardians when properly trained. Sarah's first action was to secure the area and check on her cattle, who had remained calm throughout the confrontation because they were accustomed to the presence and protection of their wolf guardians. Her second action was to examine the equipment the intruders had brought with them: professional-grade cattle handling tools, poisoned bait designed to kill guard animals, and enough firepower to handle significant resistance. This was not a crime of opportunity, but a planned operation by experienced thieves who had come prepared for violence. The Johnson brothers, lying pinned beneath creatures they now realized were not dogs at all, experienced a level of terror that neither had ever imagined possible. The wolves' yellow eyes reflected an intelligence that was alien and predatory, completely different from the loyalty and submission they associated with domestic animals. These were wild hunters that had chosen to spare their lives, and both men understood instinctively that this mercy could be withdrawn at any moment. Jake, with his military background, recognized the tactical superiority of the wolves' coordinated attack. They had used darkness, silence, and superior knowledge of the terrain to achieve complete surprise. They had neutralized two armed men without sustaining any injuries and without giving their targets any opportunity to fight back or escape. It was a textbook ambush executed with the kind of precision that would have impressed his former commanding officers. Pete, who prided himself on his understanding of animal behavior, realized that he had completely misunderstood the nature of Sarah's guardians. These were not trained dogs following commands, but intelligent partners making conscious decisions about how to respond to threats. The wolf holding him down was not acting on blind instinct, but was deliberately choosing to use just enough force to immobilize him without causing permanent injury. Sarah called the sheriff's department, knowing that the presence of armed intruders on her property justified the use of any necessary force to protect herself and her livestock. She also knew that this incident would likely bring unwanted attention to her wolves and could potentially result in demands for their removal or destruction. The delicate balance she had maintained between her unconventional protection methods and legal compliance was now threatened by the very success of those methods. While waiting for law enforcement to arrive, Sarah kept her wolves in position and questioned the intruders about their intentions and methods. What she learned disturbed her more than the immediate threat they had posed. The Johnson brothers were part of a larger network of cattle thieves that had been operating across the region for years. They had detailed information about ranch security measures, cattle values, and law enforcement response times that suggested they had inside help and significant resources. More troubling was their admission that they had successfully eliminated guard dogs on other ranches using methods that were both cruel and effective. Sarah realized that if her neighbors had been dealing with similar threats, their conventional security measures had been proven inadequate against professional criminals who were prepared to kill any animals that stood in their way. The arrival of Sheriff Martinez and his deputies created a new set of challenges. While the sheriff was familiar with Sarah's wolves and had grudgingly accepted their presence on her ranch, the sight of them holding two men at bay was shocking even to law enforcement officers who thought they had seen everything. The wolves remained in position until Sarah gave them a specific command to withdraw, demonstrating a level of discipline and control that impressed even the skeptical deputies. The Johnson brothers were arrested and charged with attempted cattle theft, trespassing, and possession of weapons intended for use in the commission of a felony. The poison bait they had brought with them added charges of attempted animal cruelty and possession of illegal toxins. Their equipment and vehicles were impounded as evidence, effectively dismantling their operation and providing law enforcement with information about their previous crimes. But the real impact of the incident extended far beyond the arrest of 3 cattle thieves. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the ranching community, carried by the deputies who had witnessed the aftermath and the emergency medical technicians who had treated the brothers' injuries. Sarah's wolves had not only protected her property, but had done so in a way that demonstrated their intelligence, restraint, and effectiveness as guardians. The story that emerged from that night was one that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between civilization and wilderness. Sarah's wolves had proven that apex predators could be partners rather than enemies, guardians rather than threats, allies in protecting the very livestock they were naturally designed to hunt. But such partnerships came with risks and responsibilities that most people were not prepared to accept. As dawn broke over her ranch, Sarah stood in her pasture surrounded by her cattle and watched her wolves retreat to their resting places after their successful defense of their territory. She knew that everything had changed with this incident, that the quiet life she had built with her unusual family was now under scrutiny that could prove more dangerous than any human threat. The Rustlers had been defeated, but the real battle for the survival of her experiment was just beginning. The news of Sarah Mackenzie's wolf guardians defeating armed cattle rustlers spread across Montana like wildfire, carried by social media, local newspapers, and the kind of word-of-mouth storytelling that turned ordinary events into legends. Within a week of the incident, Sarah found herself at the center of a controversy that would test everything she believed about the possibility of coexistence between human civilization and wild nature. Television news crews arrived first, followed by reporters from wildlife magazines and academic researchers from universities across the country. Sarah's ranch became a destination for curiosity seekers, wolf enthusiasts, and livestock protection specialists who wanted to see for themselves the unprecedented partnership she had developed. The quiet valley that had once known only the sounds of cattle and wildlife now echoed with the noise of vehicles, generators, and crowds of people who had come to witness something they believed was impossible. The attention brought both support and opposition in equal measure. Wildlife conservation groups hailed Sarah as a pioneer who had proven that coexistence with apex predators was not only possible but beneficial. Letters and emails poured in from people around the world who saw her work as a model for resolving human-wildlife conflicts that had persisted for centuries. Several universities offered her research positions and funding to continue her work under scientific supervision. However, the ranching community's reaction was far more divided and complicated. While some of her neighbors admired her success and began inquiring about adopting similar methods, others viewed her wolves as a fundamental threat to their way of life. The Montana Cattlemen's Association issued a statement expressing concern about the precedent her methods might set and the potential dangers of encouraging people to keep wild predators as livestock guardians. The most serious opposition came from an unexpected source: the families of the Johnson brothers. Despite the clear evidence that Jake, Pete, and Danny had been engaged in criminal activity, their relatives hired a prominent attorney who argued that Sarah's wolves constituted an illegal trap designed to injure trespassers. The lawyer filed civil lawsuits claiming that the brothers had suffered psychological trauma and physical injuries that would prevent them from working, and demanded compensation for their pain and suffering. More troubling was the involvement of a radical anti-predator group called the Western Heritage Foundation, which had been formed by ranchers who had lost livestock to wild wolf packs and mountain lions. The organization's leader, a wealthy rancher named Thomas Garrett, saw Sarah's success as a betrayal of everything the agricultural community stood for. He began organizing protests and lobbying efforts aimed at forcing the removal of her wolves and preventing others from following her example. Garrett's arguments resonated with many people who had been affected by predator attacks on their livestock. He pointed out that Sarah's wolves, despite their training, remained wild animals capable of unpredictable and dangerous behavior. He questioned what would happen if they ever attacked a human visitor to a ranch, or if they decided to hunt cattle instead of protecting them. His group began circulating petitions demanding that state wildlife officials revoke Sarah's permits and relocate her wolves to proper wilderness areas. The legal pressure intensified when the state attorney general's office began investigating whether Sarah's permits were legally sufficient to authorize keeping wolves as livestock guardians. The original permits had been issued for wildlife research purposes, and some officials argued that using the wolves for ranch protection went beyond the scope of what had been approved. A complex legal battle emerged involving wildlife law, property rights, zoning regulations, and public safety concerns. Sarah found herself spending more time with lawyers and government officials than with her cattle and wolves. The permits that had once protected her unusual arrangement now seemed inadequate in the face of the scrutiny her success had brought. She was required to submit detailed reports on her wolves' behavior, undergo regular inspections by wildlife officials, and prove that her methods posed no threat to public safety. The stress of the situation began affecting her relationships with Storm, Shadow, and Frost. The constant presence of strangers on their territory made the wolves anxious and defensive. They began exhibiting behaviors that concerned Sarah, including increased territorial marking, more aggressive responses to unfamiliar scents, and a reluctance to venture far from their established safe areas. The bond between Sarah and her pack remained strong, but the external pressure was taking its toll on all of them. The breaking point came when a group of protesters led by Thomas Garrett attempted to force their way onto Sarah's property during what they called a citizen's inspection. The wolves, already stressed by weeks of unusual activity around their territory, perceived the large group of shouting strangers as a serious threat. Storm positioned himself between the protesters and Sarah's cabin, while Shadow and Frost flanked the group in a defensive formation that was unmistakably threatening. The confrontation was captured on video by news crews who had followed the protesters, and the footage of 3 large wolves facing down a crowd of humans was broadcast across the country. While Sarah managed to call her wolves back before anyone was injured, the images reinforced every stereotype about the danger of keeping wild predators near human habitation. The incident provided Thomas Garrett and his supporters with the evidence they needed to demand immediate action from state authorities. Within days of the confrontation, Sarah received notice that her permits were being suspended pending a comprehensive review of her operation. She was given 30 days to either relocate her wolves to an approved wildlife facility or surrender them to state authorities for relocation to a wilderness area. The decision was presented as a matter of public safety that could not be appealed through normal administrative channels. The news of the permit suspension brought supporters of Sarah's work out in force. Environmental groups organized protests at the state capitol, while scientists and wildlife experts testified about the value of her research and the potential applications of her methods. A crowdfunding campaign raised money for legal challenges to the state's decision, and several prominent celebrities lent their names to the cause of saving Sarah's wolves. But Sarah herself was torn between her desire to protect her wolves and her recognition of the impossible situation they all faced. The attention and controversy had transformed her quiet ranch into a battleground where neither she nor her wolves could live peacefully. Every day brought new protesters, reporters, and curiosity seekers who disturbed the delicate balance she had worked years to establish. The stress was affecting not only the wolves, but also her cattle, who had become skittish and difficult to manage in the face of constant disruption. The legal battle that followed was complex and expensive, involving constitutional questions about property rights, scientific freedom, and wildlife management authority. Sarah's legal team argued that her permits had been legally obtained and that the state had no right to revoke them based on political pressure rather than scientific evidence. They presented testimony from wildlife experts who confirmed that her wolves posed no greater threat to public safety than properly managed domestic dogs. The state's attorneys countered that the permits had never been intended to authorize the use of wolves as livestock guardians, and that the public safety risks of such arrangements outweighed any potential benefits. They pointed to the confrontation with protesters as evidence that the wolves were potentially dangerous, and that their presence created an ongoing threat to anyone who might encounter them. During the months of legal proceedings, Sarah faced a painful choice. She could continue fighting to keep her wolves, knowing that the ongoing controversy would make their lives increasingly difficult and stressful. Or she could accept that her experiment, however successful, had attracted more attention and opposition than she could handle, and agreed to relocate Storm, Shadow, and Frost to a wilderness sanctuary where they could live peacefully away from human conflict. The decision was made easier by the wolves themselves, whose behavior made it clear that they were suffering under the constant stress of their situation. Storm had begun showing signs of depression, spending long hours alone and showing less interest in his patrol duties. Shadow had become increasingly aggressive toward strangers, requiring Sarah to keep her confined whenever visitors were present. Frost, the most emotionally sensitive of the three, had started exhibiting stress behaviors including excessive grooming and loss of appetite. Sarah realized that her love for her wolves meant accepting that their well-being was more important than proving her theories about human-wildlife coexistence. She negotiated an agreement with state wildlife officials that would allow her to relocate Storm, Shadow, and Frost to a large wilderness preserve where they could live as wild wolves while remaining under the protection of wildlife authorities who understood their unique background. The day of the relocation was one of the most difficult of Sarah's life. The wolves seemed to understand that something significant was happening, and their behavior reflected the confusion and stress that major changes create in intelligent animals. Storm remained close to Sarah throughout the morning, while Shadow and Frost patrolled their territory one final time, as if saying goodbye to the place they had protected for so long. The wilderness preserve where the wolves were relocated was everything Sarah could have hoped for. Thousands of acres of natural habitat with abundant wildlife, clear streams, and the freedom to behave as wild wolves without human interference. The facility's staff included experts who understood the wolves' unique background and were committed to allowing them to readjust to wild behavior patterns while ensuring their safety and well-being. The final chapter of Sarah's story was bittersweet. Her ranch returned to using conventional security methods, including guard dogs and electronic surveillance systems that were effective, but lacked the intelligence and adaptability of her wolf guardians. She received regular reports about Storm, Shadow, and Frost, who had successfully integrated into their new environment and were displaying increasingly natural behaviors as they readjusted to life without human partnership. The scientific community continued studying Sarah's work, using her detailed records and observations to better understand the potential for human-wildlife cooperation. Several universities established research programs based on her methods, working with controlled populations of various predator species to explore the possibilities she had demonstrated. Her techniques were adopted by wildlife managers in other countries, where different cultural attitudes toward predators made such experiments more acceptable. Sarah herself became a consultant for wildlife management agencies and conservation organizations, sharing her expertise in predator behavior and human-animal relationships. She wrote a book about her experience that became required reading in wildlife management courses and inspired a new generation of researchers to explore unconventional approaches to conservation challenges. The ranching community remained divided about the lessons to be learned from Sarah's experience. Some saw it as proof that coexistence with predators was possible under the right circumstances, while others viewed it as evidence that wild animals belonged in the wilderness rather than on working ranches. The debate continued long after the immediate controversy had faded, reflecting deeper questions about humanity's relationship with the natural world. Years later, when people asked Sarah whether she regretted her decision to work with wolves, her answer was always the same. She had no regrets about trying something that everyone said was impossible, about proving that the boundaries between civilization and wilderness were not as fixed as people believed, and about demonstrating that intelligence and patience could overcome centuries of conflict and mistrust. The story of the woman who trained wolves to protect her cattle became a legend in the American West, passed down through generations of ranchers, wildlife managers, and anyone who believed that the relationship between humans and nature could be something more than an endless war. It was a reminder that sometimes the most effective solutions to old problems came from people who were brave enough to ignore conventional wisdom and bold enough to trust in possibilities that others could not imagine. And somewhere in the Montana wilderness, 3 wolves continued to demonstrate the lessons Sarah had taught them about cooperation, protection, and the complex bonds that could exist between species that had once been mortal enemies. Their story had ended one chapter but begun another, proving that the impact of genuine understanding between humans and wildlife could extend far beyond the boundaries of any single ranch or the lifetime of any single partnership.